Welcome to the Future of Growth podcast with Agrify. Here, we'll be exploring all things related to cannabis, ag tech, controlled environment agriculture, vertical farming, cultivation science, industry trends, and more. Informed by science and driven by data, episodes will enlighten our audience through open dialogue with thought leaders, innovators, and industry disruptors who are forging the future of growth. Join our host, David Kessler, Chief Science Officer at Agrify, as he dives into the many facets that cannabis and agriculture have to offer. Stay connected with Agrify by joining us on all platforms at Agrify Corp and by visiting our website, www.agrify.com. Sit tight for another episode of The Future of Growth, coming at you now.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Kessler, the Chief Science Officer at Agrify. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of The Future of Growth. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Nick Tennant. Nick is the founder and Chief Technology Officer at Precision Extraction Solutions, the global leader in cannabis extraction equipment, technology, site planning, compliance, and training. Nick has been a cannabis entrepreneur for over 12 years and has developed and operated cannabis companies within the industry. Nick, thank you so much for coming on, for joining our show and enlightening our audience today.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
I really am so thrilled. Nick, you've been featured on multiple TV networks from CNN to CNBC, papers like the New York Times and Time Magazine. You've written for dozens, if not hundreds of publications and contributed to trade journals. At this point, you are a veteran in the industry. In fact, probably one of the oldest veterans in the industry that I've had the pleasure of speaking with, because your entrance into this industry really got started fairly early. Now, how is it that you I guess, got involved in the cannabis industry when it was so nascent, when it was at its very earliest formation?
Yeah, sure. So I actually had family in the cannabis industry back all the way in 2005, 2006. And I started to travel to see my family in Colorado and California. And, you know, they kind of started showing me the ropes, and I kind of started looking at the opportunities and assessing the landscape, so forth and so on. I've always been an entrepreneur my entire adult life. So as I sized those opportunities up, we stayed in touch. And obviously in 2008, Michigan passed their law here. And when they passed their law, we were the 40th person to get licensed. So we stood up grows pretty fast relative to getting our license once we had it. And from 2008 to 2009, 2010, we ran a trade school. So we trained people on how to actually grow, how to start cannabis businesses, how to obtain licensing, did all sorts of other things, obviously played with the edibles and the extracts back then even, and also started to stand up some retail, which was kind of a gray area at the time. You know, the early market, early entrance in the retail space in Michigan was a little bit hairy, but so we've kind of done it all. And through that, we met a lot of, so to speak, pioneers of the industry and kind of dropped those roots into the industry very, very early on, because really relative to Michigan, the only states that were preceding us was Washington, Oregon, California, and Colorado. And that's kind of where we had that established market. So myself and my friend group, not only did have family out there, but also established connections, through the Emerald Triangle and all throughout that region. So we really learned from the people that started very, very early and took that knowledge base, brought it to Michigan, and ultimately, obviously, expanded into precision and what we have today.
Now, I think it's so interesting that you started by obtaining your own cultivation license, but very quickly realized that there was a need for education within the industry on cultivation, on retail. I guess in those early days, where did you see that need coming from? Because it must have been a pivot from operating your own entity to training people on how to operate theirs and then effectively compete with what you were trying to do.
Yeah, we did. It's funny. We did train our competition, but we were always of the mindset that the market is just so big it's never going to really even touch what we're able to disseminate in terms of information. And we still believe that, right? Always a mindset of abundance in that regard. But we knew that the opportunity was there because we saw what had happened in Colorado, in California, in Oregon, and Washington. And legislatively, the momentum was only going one way, right? It's like the train had left the station. And we knew that ultimately cannabis was going to thrive nationwide, which we were obviously correct in that prediction. But at the time, you saw this change in not only a lot of lobbying money coming into these legislative bodies in order to change cannabis laws, but more importantly, you saw the social aspect of it change, where it was so traditionally demonized, so traditionally just taboo. That was starting to change, right? And the narrative was starting to change. The media narrative was starting to change, and it was swaying public opinion. And I think that social change really gave us a lot of confidence that things were more widely accepted. And we knew that the industry was going to continue to grow. And ultimately, we just ran some metrics about the amount of people in the United States and the amount of people that, for instance, consume alcohol relative to cannabis, and how big cannabis could really become should this legislative initiative that the Marijuana Policy Project at the time was trying to push through. And they're still probably the largest grassroots advocacy group. But back then, they were funded by a bunch of angel capital, and they were just hitting the ground in all of these states, just lobbying so hard. And it was just like this tidal wave that we thought was never going to go away. And it obviously hasn't. It's only gone one way.
I fully agree. The trajectory of the industry has been one directional moving forward. And what's amazing, and you point out to the social change combined with not just the social element of our citizenry, but of TV's attitude, print media's attitude. We went from someone smoking a joint in an after-school special being demonized to every single sitcom that's on in prime time pretty much making a joke about cannabis one night or another every week. So clearly the demonization of cannabis has changed. We're looking at it now as a panacea of potential medicines, of potential methods we can treat different conditions. And so, early medical legislation in Michigan, for example, it was really focused on the medical benefits. They limited plant count. You guys were restricted to 72 plant maximum. And that has a very different cultivation style than some of our cultivators that now are, growing hundreds, if not thousands or 10,000s of plants at a time. So how did those early days in Michigan, the regulations that you were trying to follow and that constantly seemed to evolve underneath your feet, how was it trying to stay abreast of such a changing market and changing regulated environment?
Yeah, it was a little precarious, to be honest, right? You always wondered how far you could stick your arm out without getting it chopped off to some degree. And we never really pushed the limits too much. We always stayed obviously compliant with everything that we did. But yeah, as you said, people would really push the limits, and there was a lot of people that went down for doing things like that, whether you were above your plant count or just doing things that were way too far out in the gray area. And, we really started to go large scale medical and recreational a few years ago with new laws and complete, obviously, adult use recreational. And it put together a different construct, right? It put together what should have been probably done from the get-go, where you really have valid license vetting. You have proper plant counts, whether it's an A, B, or C tier growing license. That's 500, 1,000, and 1,500 plants. And obviously you have stackable licenses as well. So, it was a long road, right? Because we had that from from 2008 all the way to roughly 2019 before you really started to be able to plan to go to the next level. And it was definitely a long road. A lot of people were in it. You think you were in it for a decade before you even got to any appreciable scale at your business, if you were in the state of Michigan anyways. A lot of these companies that were dabbling too, the lines between the states often get blurred. Operators own multiple operations. Obviously, the MultiState Operators own multiple operations throughout the United States. So these are all things to take into consideration. But I think it's just overall natural evolution of the cannabis market. And that's just, it's taking the path of least resistance, right? Because you have legislative blocks, you have economic blocks, you have all these sort of social, even still social blocks, obviously more conservative southern states, slower to come online. So the opening of the market, so to speak, and the opening of the use has taken a path almost like water, kind of the path of least resistance. But in that, the more it flows, the more momentum it gains.
That is the truth. And we have a lot of momentum now. So when did your momentum, or when did your attention shift from cultivation and training and really what I would liken to a full suite of consulting to an area of specialization where, Nick, you really pioneered some of the hydrocarbon extraction techniques. But before that, people were open blasting, they were doing dry ice and water hash. But how did you then focus your attention on concentrates, on extraction? And tell us about that part of the journey.
Sure. So when we were in the industry, we were still doing concentrates. Like you said, we've done a lot of water hashes. I've made a lot of water hash, a lot of dry ice hash, a lot of blowing through open tubes. I'm sorry to say, but back in the day, that's the way it was. And, it really picked up, I would say, in like 2012, 2013. You started to see the Pacific Northwest start to make some really nice artisanal extracts. And I started to kind of conceptualize, okay, what could this potentially look like, right? Because when you're making an extract, even if you have a bad crop, you can purify it. Even if, you want to make an edible, you can stabilize the dosing. You can make things like live resin, which we know about now. We didn't back then. But some of these artisanal water hashes and even like the artisanal pressed Moroccan hashes, just super desirable and always have been super desirable traditionally. So I started just kind of conceptualizing in my head, rolling it around and started looking at other industries. And, you have natural flavorings and all sorts of different botanical extracts that are used rather, ubiquitously through all other industries. And I kind of thought about it the same way in cannabis. Like if there's a better way to consume, people are always going to gravitate towards that. Mm-hmm. And when I really started understanding the fundamentals of everything that you could do with the extract, I started to think about the ways that you could make it, right? Whether it's mechanical or solvent based, et cetera, and really started to conceptualize, okay, you can make extracts, you can capture the native terpenes and cannabinoids from the plant. You can reconstitute those into different things like edibles, topicals, tinctures, vape pens, right? It's kind of like a limitless plethora of products that you can reconstitute extracts into. And I started to think, if this catches on, people are really going to gravitate away from smoking flower to some degree, because there's the purists, myself one of them, honestly, that love flower, right? The natural native essence of the plant. It grows in a certain way. And there's something very sacred about smoking it in that way. But there's also these different methodologies of consumption, right? You can't fire up a joint in a casino, but you can sure as hell hit your vape pen. If you've got kids, you're not going to, again, smoke a joint in your house. But if you can't sleep and eat a 5 milligram edible or a 5 milligram gummy that you keep locked away, it's a more convenient way to consume. And as we realized that it was a more convenient way to consume, we thought that it would gravitate really towards the masses. And it would really give an opportunity for ordinary people to start using cannabis recreationally, the same way that they use alcohol, right? Whether it's to relax or just socially to enjoy themselves. And that really kind of solidified that thesis in my head. And then ultimately, I started looking at the technology after that. I'm like, okay, I'm bought in, I'm 100%, I'm all in. This is definitely going to be the future. How do we make the best possible extracts in the world? So we started looking at all the traditional technologies that they use in normal botanicals, started looking at all the traditional technologies that they would use in all sorts of like artisanal extracts like vanilla and cacao and all these other things, lavenders. And there's a varying amount of different extracts or methodologies of extraction, right? Whether it's steam distillation or it's organic solvents. And then within organic solvents, you have alcohols, you have hydrocarbons, you have all these different organic molecules that will solubilize the cannabinoids and the terpenes. Obviously, you have CO2, which was existing, and that kind of came over from like decaffeination techniques and, again, vanilla bean, things like that, saffron. And so we needed to identify what was the best methodology to make the best extract. And hydrocarbon, both from a trial and error standpoint throughout the industry, but also from a chemistry and chemical standpoint, is the superior solvent for making artisanal extracts. Now, it doesn't scale well, obviously, because it's pressure and flammable and so forth. But in terms of making artisanal extracts, between that and really artisanal water hash, and then subsequent water hash going into rosin, those are probably the absolute creme de la creme.
Nick, I agree that the high end are the hydrocarbon extracts and then the live textures that really preserve a lot of the unique terpene profile and cannabinoid, as well as the full spectrum of cannabinoids and phytochemicals that the plant can produce. But maybe we can just spend a quick minute and I'll pose different methods of extraction and you can give a high level, where it's good, where it's bad, and educate our listeners a little bit. So we're going to be talking about hydrocarbon quite at length throughout this chat today, but let's talk about CO2. I see CO2 used a lot, and I'm sure it has an application. What are your thoughts on where CO2 is really an ideal solvent as opposed to maybe a suboptimal one?
Yeah, so I guess we start with the fundamentals, which is the chemical properties, right? So CO2 has to be put into a subcritical or supercritical form in order to be able to extract the cannabis molecule. So you can almost think of it like a lock and key is the analogy that I use a lot. We're always trying to find the right key. The lock is the cannabinoids and the terpenes. And CO2 as a solvent is actually a very weak solvent. It has a very low solubility, which is why you have to, or at least cannabinoids have a very low solubility within supercritical or subcritical CO2, which is why you have to use generally a lot of pressure, sometimes upwards of 2,000 to 5,000 PSI, in order to solubilize these cannabinoids. And not only that, you have to spend a very long amount of time passing the CO2 over the cannabinoids. So a lot of these CO2 devices that you'll see, they'll actually cycle, and they'll cycle for hours and hours and hours. And that's just really continually passing the CO2 over the cannabinoids in order to solubilize them. And it's, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, right? It's like trying to dissolve something in water that's just not very dissolvable.
Well, how about this? What if I likened it to trying to melt ice with 34-degree water? Eventually, you will dissolve the ice into the water. However, it's going to take a long time and multiple passes because the CO2, or in this case, the ice, isn't going to be as liquefiable with cold water as it would be with hot. So it is not a very good solvent, in this case, cold water for the ice, as likened to a cannabinoid in supercritical CO2. So they're continually passing this high pressure chilled CO2 over the biomass to try and pull out a little bit more cannabinoid with each pass. And so it's a very time-consuming process, you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Time-consuming, inefficient. Obviously, the equipment initially on startup is extremely capital intensive also, right? And, one of the big things that they say is, oh, you're not using a flammable solvent. But the caveat to that is, number one, the amount of CO2, if it ever gets released, it still has to be in a classified room because you can become rapidly asphyxiated. And number two, you're at 5,000 PSI. So, something ever flies off of one of these machines or somebody comes in hungover and doesn't tighten down a bolt, that's coming out like a bullet out of a gun.
That's very dangerous. So I appreciate carbon dioxide isn't flammable, but being able to suffocate you and shoot a nut off like it was a bullet seems a little bit dangerous. And I don't think this one's going to be any safer. But what about alcohol? Typically, ethanol is used as the solvent there.
Yeah, so ethanol is actually a pretty good solvent. It's pretty good because the cannabinoids and the terpenes have extremely good solubility, right? So it can dissolve those cannabinoids pretty quickly, not quite as quick as hydrocarbon, but pretty quickly. The difference with ethanol versus hydrocarbon is ethanol is extremely polar, meaning it's going to pick up all the polar compounds like chlorophyll. A lot of ways that guys get around this is they chill their ethanol very deep, and it changes the solubility enough where the water soluble compounds kind of get locked out when you do the extraction. But even still, ethanol is not used to produce artisanal extracts. It's just not, right? You would use hydrocarbon or you would make some sort of water hash or rosin. Ethanol is very good for scaling. So if we're making large scale distillate, or we want to make high volumes of crude oil or something like that, you can understand why it's easier to scale ethanol because it's not pressurized. And while it is flammable, it's substantially less flammable than like a group D hydrocarbon gas, right? Because hydrocarbon will vaporize readily at room temperature, becomes extremely flammable and has a very lower explosive limit, where ethanol is not quite the same, right? And because of that fact, you can have a substantially larger amount of ethanol in any facility before you cross into what's called a hazardous rating or an H classification. And for those reasons, it makes ethanol a solvent or a methodology of extraction where if we're doing, we'll call it threshold somewhere over 1,000 pounds a day. If we want to process over 1,000 pounds a day and we want to put it into distillates or vape pens or some sort of just bulk extract like crude, the right methodology to use is ethanol. If we're going to make, artisanal extracts, whether it's live resin, shatter butter, waxes, things like that, we're going to use hydrocarbon or we're going to move towards water hash or rosin, things like that.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that people have talked about with ethanol is, aside from the process, there's a post-process in order to clean up the impurities. Maybe we should just run through a little bit of that because with different solvents, you have different post-processes based on the different chemical compounds that are extracted. And when we're talking about artisanal quality versus, bulk large scale, what are these compounds that are getting in the way that are, I guess, degrading the quality of the concentrate?
Sure. So they vary from plant to plant, but we'll use kind of a blanket statement. The two main ones would be the lipids, phospholipids, and those are coming, if you ever go up to a tree or up to a plant, you kind of rub the leaves in between your fingers, you kind of get that waxy type of substance. That's the lipids and the phospholipids that are within the plant, and they're meant to protect the cellular membrane of the plant. Not really indifferent to humans, right? Humans obviously are, the cell membrane is made up of a lot of phospholipid. And what happens is when we hit those with a solvent, they generally dissolve, especially or an organic solvent. This is true of ethanol and of hydrocarbon. The second constituent that is highly undesirable that we want to stay away from is chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is obviously pretty much ubiquitous in most, if not all, plants. And really what happens is with the more polar the solvent, the more chlorophyll we're going to pick up. Chlorophyll is water soluble. And so with ethanol, we generally pick up a lot more chlorophyll. That's why with ethanol, you'll need to do things in a lot of instances like a brine wash or have a lenticular filter with carbon on the back end. There's obviously all sorts of different methodologies for delipidization or dewaxing. But I guess the overarching thing that people should understand is no matter how bad the crude oil comes out and what sort of other constituents are picked up from that initial extraction, the technologies are there to refine those crude oils into whatever end product you want within reason, right? And the opposite is when we're dealing with artisanal products. With artisanal products, we're really taking a tremendous amount of care of how that initial cannabis is grown, because what happens is we're trying to capture the native essence of the plant just in an extracted form, right? So we want the terpenes and the cannabinoids to be, as you said, at the same native ratios. And we want them to be in the same full spectrum, almost as if you're smoking that plant, but you're not smoking any of the chlorophyll or any of the cellular structure or the phospholipids, right? So we have a purified extract of all the good parts of the plant. Now, we can use refinement methodologies. And I mean, this gets into very far, very wide, very deep, because there's so many techniques that'll make your head spin. And I kind of liken it to a chef in a kitchen, right? You have your stove, you have your pots and your pans, your griddle, your fridge, what have you. And a chef knows how to use all these tools at the right times and the right ratios to cook the right recipe. And the best chefs make amazing recipes. And you can kind of think that same analogy in terms of extract. It really is very much an art, while the fundamentals hold true. And there's different solvents and different methodologies. Absolutely, these are very talented people that are making these products.
There's no question. And calling them artisanal or craft, I think really is good at capturing what people are trying to put out in terms of product quality and product form factors. So I've seen a huge push on the live textures, which do try and encapsulate that full spectrum or natural essence of the plant. What other textures are you seeing get popularized? And do you have any predictions about things that might not be available today that we might start seeing in the future?
That's interesting. It's always hard to see where the market's going to go in terms of trends. I mean, we can look at the trends from dispensaries and so forth, but the fact is it's, these chefs, so to speak, within the lab, they're so sharp, right? I mean, they come up with all sorts of crazy stuff, whether it's recrystallization of THCA and recombining it with terpenes for like a diamond sauce type product. One of the big things that we're seeing right now in our client base is live resin pens, right? Less distillate, because people generally, I think it's like an artisanal way to smoke a plant, but still in an extract in a vape pen without having any sort of cutting or additives, or without recombining terpenes that are non-native to the plant, if that makes sense, right? So it's like almost like an organic vape pen, you can liken it to. But, ever since the whole vape crisis with the vitamin E acetate and the whatever else they were using, right, the MCT and all the other cutting agents, who knows what was in some of that stuff. The industry kind of found a way to just literally keep the viscosity exactly the way that it needs to be to go into a vape pen. And that's really, it's a live resin vape pen, right? So we do that with hydrocarbon with the right parameters, pressures, temperatures. We can make an extract with a proper viscosity that can be loaded right into a vape pen. And I think that's right now probably one of the hottest selling items across the country.
Nick, I've seen them here in Colorado for a year or two, and the earlier entrants had issues with stabilization. So the viscosity of the oil that went in, or the extract that went in, over time changed, and it really became less functional as a product. Has that difficulty been overcome? No trade secrets being asked, just curious if that problem has been solved.
Yeah, I think for the most part, yes, right? There's a lot of chemistry that goes into the stability of the vape pens. One is how long they're on their shelf, the packaging, the actual construction of the atomizer and the geometry of the actual cell, and then the stability of the extract within it. What terpenes are in there? What does that profile look like? How are they volatilizing or oxidizing over time? These are all variables, but again, these are things that most of the talented individuals within these labs have been able to surmount a lot of these. On the other side of the spectrum too, what you may be seeing is a lot of the CBD-based products are combined with CBD. Decarboxylated CBD in its neutral form or non-acidic form, meaning it's been heated after it's been extracted, crystallizes naturally at any concentration, really arguably above 70% ish. And there's things that you can do to stop anti-crystallizing agents, and again, now you're getting more additives into these vape pens. But that was really a problem, still is, because the molecule just naturally wants to crystallize.
And, as much as I enjoy those textures, I enjoy getting all of my product out of those vape cartridges. And it's always nice when they have the formulation, you can enjoy it all the way down.
Yep.
One of the other things I see a lot of now, and it's not new technology, but it's making a resurgence, I'd see, is CRC, or color correction in concentrates. Maybe we can talk about why that became popularized in terms of what a good extract looks like visually versus a maybe lower grade extract, and then how CRC is incorporated to improve product quality.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's probably important for the audience to understand the overarching sort of fundamentals of CRC. So what that looks like is, we have what we call a micella. The micella is your natural constituents that are extracted from the plant. So that's your cannabinoids, your terpenes, your waxes, but also all your undesirables, right? It could be things like phenolphthalein that are changing the color of the extract. It could be all these sorts of oxidized compounds if the biomass has been sitting. It can obviously be chlorophyll, cellulose structure. These are all things that are coming out. Often in cases, it's also pesticides, herbicides, molds, mildews, things like that, right? Those are coming over into the extract. And what's important to understand about CRC is again, this lock and key methodology. So there's all these different types of media, and some of these media can be like crushed chitosan, which comes from crushed seashells, crustaceans, crab, things like that. There's things like silica, natural silica. There's all sorts of different sands. There's things like B80, B81, activated carbons. There's impregnated silicas. I mean, the world of media is just, there's thousands of them, right? And then you can combine all of these. So each of these media has a specific affinity for an individual compound. Now, whether that compound is chlorophyll or whether it's, again, something like phenolphthalein or one of these adulterants that's in the product, whether it's myclobutanol from somebody using Eagle 20, the important part to understand is you can use these compounds, these vastly inert compounds. Sometimes they're ion exchange resins that have different charges of particles that have affinity for certain molecules. The science goes very deep on this, but we can use these media in order to selectively remove an individual molecule from this pool or micella or matrices of molecules, right? And it's extremely useful. So a lot of people do use this for color, which is why they call it CRC, color remediation. In more appropriate technical terminology would probably be just chromatography, whether it's reverse phase or regular phase or flash or anything like that, right? It's passing through these media. And it gets very loose, right? Because now we get back into the science, the art of it. It's different pressures, different temperatures, different carrier solvents, different media, taking the actual micella and passing it through something like an HPLC, MSMS, in order to identify what are these non-desirable constituents and what media can we use to remove these. So one of the largest applications for this has obviously been pesticide remediation, because pesticides in cannabis, or at least in some states, are pretty widespread, particularly the Eagle 20, the myclobutanol is the technical term for it. And it's used for anybody that doesn't know, it's used to knock back the powdery mildew, which these varieties of powdery mildew nowadays, after they've adapted to these plants for a decade, they're just, there's something to be dealt with for sure. But also same thing with the russet mites and the spider mites, right? They've gone through this natural evolution. They're like these zombie mites that I've seen them come into cultivation sites and just be an absolute battle to get rid of. So you start getting some of these nasty chemicals, but with CRC, we can use this to remove these chemicals down to completely non-detect levels. When I say completely non-detect levels, I'm talking about non-detect on a parts per billion scale. So less pesticide than would be on your apple at the grocery store, right? And these technologies will continue to really be used throughout the industry. They'll continue to evolve. And I think that they'll continue to be used ubiquitously throughout a lot of different extractors, because it's such a precision instrument to use, right? It's like an X-Acto knife. You just go in and cut out what you don't want. It takes a lot of science to do it, and it takes a lot of guessing and checking and a lot of diligence to do it, but the technology is definitely there.
That's fantastic. So when we're talking about chromatography or CRC, I'm envisioning taking a matrices, well, let's say for this example, Coca-Cola, and pouring it through layers of different material. And one layer might be good at pulling out sugar, and one might be good at pulling out carbon, and another might be good at pulling out one of the flavoring compounds. So eventually, could you liken this to pouring it through different filter elements that remove specific elements or compounds?
Yeah.
And ultimately, you're left with, at the bottom of the filter vessel, a purified version, or at least a version that's devoid of the compounds you saw negative.
That's exactly right. Yep, that's exactly right. Yep.
And from being a cultivator for upwards of 30 plus years, I have to ask, when you go to take a phenomenal flower and you are thrilled, aesthetically it looks great, there's a beautiful aroma, the terpene profile is full, the maturation of the gland heads, if you heard that they use certain products in their IPM, which is integrated pest management, say sulfur or neem oil or microbutranol, as you cited, what are the ones that you just cringe? When you're talking about making the highest quality extract, what do cultivators need to stay away from like it's the plague?
You know, I'm a purist, so I would love to say everything.
Yeah.
I'm not consuming anything that's been touched with any pesticides. I'll tell you that. Even all the food that I eat is organic, just because I'm so knowledgeable about, the cultivation and agricultural methods that they use. So I'm overly paranoid about that. With that being said, our technology can fix anything. So, it's like 6 one way, a half dozen the other, right? Literally, we can remove anything. It's all within the realm of possibility and the technologies that exist today. We actually have a full-scale R&D department. And our R&D department actually goes into a lot of these MSOs, a lot of these larger clients. We just had one that was having a really bad color issue. And we went over there, and this is literally exactly what we did, a research and development project to help them fix this color issue and just make the most efficient, effective methodologies. But I don't think there's any blanket statement for cultivators other than, in terms of their IPM, the best way to stay away from it is to not get the problem in the first place, right? Don't be bringing in clones from somebody you don't know. Make sure that you have proper environmental controls. Make sure your people are going through a clean room. I mean, these are just best agricultural practices. And I think that, an ounce of prevention is worth several pounds of treatment.
Absolutely. And to that point, everybody, if you cannot have the problem, then you don't have to use the chemicals, and you can have a beautiful product that can be extracted and concentrated to its highest potential. So, all right. We've talked about textures. We've talked about chromatography and some of these issues. You talk about your technology as being able to remediate just about any of the bad practices cultivators might have accidentally stumbled into. Tell me about the evolution of Precision's tech, because you guys have been around. You definitely have evolved your own tech. You've expanded it in different directions. I'd love to hear the story of where it started and then how it's scaled to meet the marketplace and is continuing to scale.
Yeah. So, it started on my dining room table, just tinkering around with a bunch of steel parts and figuring out what worked, and then testing those prototypes in the commercial grows that we were consulting for at the time. And, we already made amazing oil at that point relative to the methodologies that were being used. But as the market evolved, it wasn't just us. There's a lot of really, really smart pioneers with a lot of tribal knowledge, a lot of really good chemists that have come up with a lot of these different refining methodologies within the extraction space. I think we have a lot of those people on our team also. But all of these different post-processing methodologies, they absolutely have been just an evolutionary type of thing within the industry. And it's almost like just iterations of technology, kind of how the phone is getting better and better. Your mobile phone, right? We had flip phones 10 years ago. So as the technology gets better, people come up with better ideas, whether we come up with it internally or externally. We try to be at the forefront of having the disruptive technology. Now, on top of that, we also obviously have a full-time R&D lab. And the fact that we're working on method development with a lot of these large-scale MSOs, we're working on refining their processes. We're working on coming up with better methodologies for winterization or for color remediation or for removing specific pesticides, specific compounds, different methodologies for recrystallization, purification, distillation, right? It's a constant envelope of technology that you have to push. And ultimately, really, we see obsolescence of most of the equipment and most of the methodologies to some degree every 3-ish years. So generally, precision is not only always bringing new innovative products online, but also iterating our products in order to ensure that we are the best relative to the competition, so that when somebody goes to buy a distillation unit or a hydrocarbon extractor, when they assess our technology versus the competition, they know that not only are they getting the best in class technology, but they're also getting it for the best value proposition in the market, which is important because I think that because of the banking system, it's a capital intensive type of startup, right? A lot of these companies don't have access to the capital that they otherwise would. I mean, if they could go to the bank and get a loan at 3-4% the same way you can for a mortgage, it would just blow this industry wide open. But CapEx is definitely a barrier, and it's a barrier to our business. And we're really looking forward to the SAFE Act. But for all those reasons, it's important to stay close to the technology, stay close to the evolution of the technology. It's something that we've always done. Innovation has always been a core principle of our company. And as the industry matures, it will continue to be. And I don't see, the technology and innovation curve stopping in the cannabis industry anytime soon.
Well, Nick, you have always innovated ahead of the curve, not behind. So I'm eager to see where you guys land. But you bring up discussions of MSOs or multi-state operators, as well as changing political regulations on a federal level. So I'd like to unpack those a little bit, because federal legalization is something that's hot in the news and has been for the recent last 12, 16 months or more. But MSOs, multi-state operators, are really gaining traction in key markets, essentially with reproducible process, being able to replicate in different states. So how does your technology, how does your relationship with MSOs work, and how are you fostering their growth along with yours in an era of what I would say is interest in federal legalization without actually action moving it forward? So talk to me about that.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Future of Growth. We love to hear from our audience. Have a great idea for a guest or a topic you'd like us to cover? Thoughts you want to share? Reach out to media@agrify.com. Don't forget to stay connected with Agrify at Agrify Corp on all platforms, and by visiting us at www.agrify.com. See you next time for another episode of The Future of Growth.